I usually talk about pirates on this channel, but in this video we will talk about their worst nightmare, Governor Woodes Rogers. In 1780, he was appointed governor of the Bahamas and became responsible for ending Nassau as a pirate base. Many credit him as the man who ended piracy in the Caribbean. However, Rogers' early life is often neglected. The reason he was so good at fighting pirates is because he had essentially been one himself. During Queen Anne's War, he had led a privateering ship to victory against a Spanish treasure galleon in the South Sea. He sailed with buccaneers the likes of William Dampier and circumnavigated the globe. His whole life was an epic adventure worth retelling. And this is that story of Captain Woodes Rogers. But just who was Woodes Rogers? One might say he was destined for something. His ancestors included gentry, knights, and members of parliament. He was born in Poole in 1679. That town was an important port and had long been a hotbed for Puritan beliefs. He grew up with two younger siblings, Mary and John. We don't know anything about his education, but his father was a sea captain, and Woodes spent much of his youth accompanying his father at sea. The family moved to Bristol by the end of the century, and at 18 years of age, Woodes became an apprentice to the wealthy and important Yeamans family. However, Woodes only got his freedom of the city by marrying Sarah Whetstone, the daughter and heir of Captain William Whetstone. He was a prominent member of Bristol society, who was active in colonial trade and military action. England was currently fighting a massive war against France and Spain to prevent the two countries from forming a union and becoming unstoppable. Rogers was a staunch patriot and wanted to stop this union at all costs. The Franco-Spanish alliance had harmed English trade with the Spanish colonies, a trade which Rogers believed was vital for English prosperity. The key to restoring English colonial trade, and harming the French, was privateering. This is when you give private captains a commission to attack enemy shipping during times of war. It's essentially legalized piracy. Rogers began investing in privateering ventures against the French. Aside from the political, he had private reasons also. The French had ruined some of his peaceful merchant investments. Thus, privateering became a means to recoup his losses. Around 1708, Rogers got the idea to sail into the largely unexplored American Pacific to steal from the Spanish and establish trade. He received major investment and acquired two ships, the Duke and Duchess. These were small frigates of 320 and 260 tons respectively, carrying 36 and 26 cannon. The plan was to sail these small vessels around Cape Horn, plunder the Peruvian coast, capture the Manila Galleon in Mexico, and then circumnavigate the globe back to England. Doing so with overcrowded ships carrying few provisions was a task as monumental as it was dangerous. However, Rogers did not lack for inspiration. He was well read on accounts of previous adventurers who had done the Pacific trek before him. One was the now famous William Dampier. Once a buccaneer, now a published author, Dampier was quickly hired as the expedition's sailing master. Little did Rogers know that Dampier was down on his luck, having recently been banned from the Royal Navy. Dampier's relation to Rogers is very interesting. Dampier had been trained by the buccaneers who had been around to establish the golden age of piracy, and now he passed this knowledge on to one of the men responsible for ending this era. Throughout the whole period, there was a continuous link between characters, tactics, and tradition. So Rogers actually wrote a whole book on his privateering voyage, which is pretty long, so I sadly can't cover every single event in detail. Well, kinda have to breeze it through. Rogers was a very good writer, however, so I'd recommend you give his book a try. It's definitely interesting and also entertaining and a bit bizarre in some places, as we'll find out. He met his first trial pretty much right after exiting Bristol. The fleet encountered and boarded a neutral Swedish ship after suspecting her of smuggling. But since she wasn't carrying anything suspect, Rogers let her go amicably. Much of his crew were actually Dutch and Danish who hated the Swedes, and since they were privateers, they wanted loot at all costs. Rogers prevented a mutiny by clapping the ringleaders in irons and having the leader whipped. He credited his success to the large amount of officers on board. Indeed, Rogers wasn't a supreme dictator of the expedition. His investors wouldn't allow it. Instead, the two ships were run by a committee, and each ship had its own council of officers. The ship's doctor was a chairman of the committee, since he was the biggest investor aboard. The investors believed this would make him more willing to make smarter decisions, which, spoilers, no. Rogers also believed discipline to be paramount aboard his ships. The councils had drafted up a set of laws which regulated plunder and drinking. Neither did he tolerate lewdness, as he called it. When he allowed several women aboard to cook and do the laundry, he had one of them whipped for being too immodest with the boys. Rogers wasn't entirely off in his perception of health. He knew that fresh fruit was necessary to stay off the scurvy, for example. However, their biggest trial would be the frigid crossing into the Pacific. Rogers struggled at acquiring sufficient clothing for his men, and actually believed alcohol to be the best remedy against the cold. This isn't true. Alcohol only makes you feel warmer. It's a great way of tricking you into freezing to death. Rounding the Horn was their first true challenge. The high seas threatened to break the ships apart, and icy water rippled across the decks and soaked the men to their skins. Rogers feared sailing into fields of ice that could tear the ships asunder. Yet somehow, the crew remained a well-oiled machine, and they miraculously survived those horrible conditions. Finally, they had entered the Pacific Ocean. Now occurred a surprising event which would, strangely enough, cement Rogers in not only history, but world literature. On the 31st of January, they came upon the island of Juan Fernandez to resupply. Dampier had been here many times before. When he sailed with Bartholomew Sharp, they had abandoned a Mosquito Indian on the island, which Dampier later rescued. When Rogers' boats returned from the island, they did so with another survivor, named Alexander Selkirk. Selkirk had actually sailed with Dampier during the latter's rather disastrous privateering voyage. Selkirk had been so fed up with his own crew that he demanded to be marooned. After they left, he regretted it immediately, but now had no choice but to survive on this wild island. He had hunted and made clothes from goat skins. He lived inside huts made from pimento trees and long grass, and also lined with goat skins. To keep himself sane, he had read books and sung psalms from the Bible. Rogers wrote down the encounter in his journal, and a few years later, the author Daniel Defoe would use the account when writing his famous book, Robinson Crusoe. Further up the coast, Rogers decided to make some modifications to his fleet. He had his pinnaces, these were large, masted ship's boats, fitted out with a cannon in the fore to make them better at pursuing prizes. A Spanish prize was renamed The Beginning and made a privateer. Another Spanish prize was made Hospital Ship and renamed The Increase. Rogers made Selkirk her captain. Finally, he ordered the construction of a larger boat for landing men, in case he should attack the mainland. For her construction, he used a spare topmast from the Duke, and kitted her out with 4 swivel guns. Rogers' first major prize was a 500-ton ship called the Ascension. Interestingly enough, she was built like a treasure galleon, with a high stern and galleries. This isn't evidence of widespread use of galleons amongst the Spanish of the time, however, rather that this ship was an exception. The council decided to attack the town of Guayaquil. The landing force was divided into 3 parties, and it was agreed that the men would have equal shares from the town's plunder. This included everything from belt buckles to shirt silver, but women's earrings were exempt for some reason. These rules were instituted to manage the poor discipline. No sailor wanted to march on land, and Rogers expected his multicultural crew to desert. Every man was given a ticket, so he knew which company he belonged to, and every 10th man was appointed as a minor officer, sort of like a corporal. En route to Guayaquil, the pinnaces attempted to board a Spanish prize, but were brutally repelled by cannons and muskets. Amongst the casualties was Wood's younger brother, Thomas Rogers, who was shot through the head. He had only been 20 years old. Wood described it as his unspeakable sorrow, but remained determined to see the voyage through. When the expedition approached Guayaquil, they were met by cannon fire and gunshots. Rogers rightly believed this to be a celebration of a saint, but the ship's doctor thought that the Spanish were putting up resistance. Remember that the doctor was the one in charge of the expedition. Rogers' argument with the doctor delayed the attack, allowing the Spanish to evacuate their treasures and actually prepare defenses. Rogers had enough and attacked. He used ship's cannons mounted on field carriages, something never done by a buccaneer or pirate before. His men fought in disciplined lines and were hastily able to seize the town. Only 2 men were wounded. 15 Spaniards had died. After looting and ransoming the town, the fleet departed. Rogers found himself a silver-headed cane and a church bell, which he put aboard one of the ships. All of the prisoners were treated respectfully and were later released. Rogers hoped that the good relations could foster trade in a more peaceful future. Rogers was always a merchant at heart, and everything he did during his sailing career was to foster commerce. Privateering was a way to seize trade assets, explore, and establish new trade relations. Hunting pirates was a way to protect trade and establish trade posts in abandoned regions. In the Pacific, this was very much unlike the previous generation of French filibusters, who had treated their victims very poorly. Things took a turn for the worse after sacking Guayaquil. Rogers wanted to head north and pursue the Manila Galleon, but the ships badly needed maintenance. They stopped at the island of Gorgona, where Rogers and his crew fell sick with dysentery. The ship's doctor came up with a weird plan to seize a gold mine on the mainland, and when Rogers told him what a stupid idea it was, the doctor got enraged and started smack-talking Rogers at every turn. Relations aboard were souring. Rogers was forced to reduce his officers' shares to appease the men, but he wrote rather positively of them in his journal, saying that his current crew were more obedient than others. When speaking about privateers, that's really saying something. Being desperate for more men to sail the ship and man the cannons, Rogers decided to liberate 35 slaves and induct them into his crew. He ordained a black privateer from Jamaica to lead and drill them as Marines. They were given new clothes and told to see themselves as Englishmen. Rogers decided to test the mettle of his crew by hosting a mock fight. The Duchess hoisted Spanish colors, and cannons were loaded and fired without shot. Red lead had been mixed with water and was thrown over some of the men to mimic blood. These were then sent down to the surgeons, much to their confusion, who thought that the men were actually wounded. The fleet pursued the Manila Galleon fruitlessly. Rogers even considered abandoning the pursuit. In late December, one of the ships got lost. After tirelessly searching for her, they finally spotted sail and sent out a pinnace. The boat soon returned. They knew sail wasn't the lost ship. It was the Manila Galleon. The chase was on. The decks were sanded, nets were set up below the masts. Hammocks and bedding were stuffed in their netting to protect against splinters. Oakum and sheets of lead were laid out to plug leaks along the waterline, and the hatches were shut tight. The guns were charged, and the surgeons prepared their tables and instruments. Before battle, sailors were usually issued alcohol to boost their morale, Dutch courage. Well, this was a wholesome Christian Minecraft ship, and Rogers ordered instead a batch of chocolate prepared, and the men went to prayers. They could not finish before the enemy fired upon them. The Duke was able to get the weather gauge on the galleon and began bombarding her. Splinters tore the air and cannonballs flew above his head. Suddenly, Rogers fell to the deck. A musket ball had hit his left cheek and tore away a large part of his upper jaw, knocking several teeth across the deck. He was unable to speak and had to convey orders through writing. This act of courage was enough to bring the Duke in front of the galleon, from where they could rake her from stem to stern. The battle was over. Rogers had done something few rovers had done before: captured the Manila Galleon. Having regrouped with the Duchess, Rogers learned that they were pursuing another Manila Galleon, called the Begonia. Rogers had recovered from his wounds and was able to rejoin the fight. Though the English were good gunners, their cannonballs just bounced off the galleon's thick hull. Strong netting repelled boarders, and things were going badly. Rogers was wounded in the foot by a splinter and had to lie down. Having fired 500 shots for 7 hours, with only harming the Begonia's rigging, the privateers decided to retreat. Bad blood had been brewing between Woodes Rogers and Dr. Dover for some time. Rogers believed the doctor's caution at Guayaquil cost him a fortune. The doctor had talked smack behind Rogers' back. With Rogers now bedridden from his wounds, Dover was elected a new captain due to his large investment, much to Rogers' protests. He accused the doctor of having a bad temper and also being an incapable seaman. The privateers recruited some Spanish and Filipino sailors to aid him in crewing the captured prize ships, and together they set sail for Asia. After crossing the Pacific, Rogers entered the island of Guam, where he hoisted Spanish colors and traded amicably with the governor. It wasn't so strange for an English captain and crew to fly Spanish colors. the captain of the captured Manila Galleon, had in fact been an Irishman. In June of 1710, Rogers' wounds were starting to recover. He wrote in his journal that, "On the discovery of a large musket shot, which a doctor now cut out of my mouth, it having been there for 6 months, so that the upper and lower jaw being broken and almost closed, he had much ado to come at it, and several pieces of my foot and heel bone having been removed, I believe myself, thank God, in a fair way to have the use of my foot and recover my health." In the putrid, pre-industrial conditions aboard an 18th century ship, the surgery must have been a horror. Nonetheless, the rest of the voyage went relatively smooth. Much of the crew died from diseases, and Dutch allies assisted them in sailing home. On the 14th of October, Rogers' fatiguing voyage had finally come to an end. Rogers did not exactly receive a happy ending. His investors suspected he had cheated them of money, partly because he had given so much plunder away to the crew to prevent them from mutineering. The legal aftermath of the voyage was very troublesome, and despite the leadership and skill that Rogers had shown during his 3-year voyage, he had now become bankrupt, partly because of the debts his wife had racked up during his absence. Rogers remained in Bristol for a while before he set his eyes on Madagascar. Legend said that the island was a kingdom of pirates that plagued trade in the region. Rogers wanted to build a permanent settlement there to end piracy and establish English commerce. The East India Company helped him finance the voyage, and in late 1713 he set sail aboard a 460-ton Delicia. Rogers did not exactly find a flourishing pirate empire on Madagascar. Rather, he was met by a bunch of stinking maroons dressed in animal skins. They had lived amongst the natives for many years and were practically begging for him to take them back. He did not trust them one bit and told his men to keep away from them, fearing that they would convince them to steal the ship and turn pirate. He did some trade with the pirates and told them to contact the Queen for clemency. He believed pardons, repenting, and Christianity to be the best weapons against piracy. When Rogers returned home in 1750, he had great plans for a Madagascar colony, but the East India Company would not have it. They believed that an English colony would harm their trade monopoly more than the various pirates operating in the area. Little could they foresee the massive resurface in Indian Ocean piracy that would occur in the late 1710s, which Rogers would indirectly be responsible for. But anyway, Rogers' plans for Madagascar were thrown in the trash. When Rogers came back home, he had become a national hero. The published journal of his privateering voyage had become a hit, and he was now a household name. His book is very well written, and I'd recommend giving it a read. Anyway, Rogers had nothing but pirates on his mind. His next plan was to subdue piracy in the Caribbean, which had seen a considerable rise since the end of the war. Former privateers had established a hideout on New Providence Island, from whence they attacked Spanish shipwrecks and merchant vessels. Many of these privateers had Jacobite leanings, meaning that they wanted to restore the recently deposed House of Stuart. Rogers himself was an avid supporter of the new king, George von Hanover. George and the Parliament represented a new Britain that stood for peaceful trade rather than relentless privateering. Rogers was a member of the influential Kit Kat Club, a really funny name of an organization of aristocrats, from whence he drew great support for his new initiative. Rogers' plan for New Providence was a joint effort between the state and private interests. A corporation of investors would provide funding, including soldiers, colonists, and supplies. The crown would contribute with a naval escort and royal pardons for all pirates that peacefully surrendered to the governor. Oh, and the new governor would be him. Rogers spent all of 1717 building political support for his scheme. In the end, he amassed a fleet of 4 ships, the Delicia being his flagship. With him were 100 soldiers and 130 English, German, and French Huguenot colonists. Lumber, tools, weaponry, food, and clothing were brought as well. He also had a parcel of religious pamphlets to appeal to the pirates' morals. On the 6th of January, 1718, King George issued his orders to Woodes Rogers. Whereas by reason of the great neglect of the proprietors of the Bahama Islands, the said islands are exposed to be plundered and ravaged by pirates and others, and are in danger of being lost from our crown of Great Britain. We, by these presents, do constitute and appoint you, Woodes Rogers, to be our Captain General and Governor-in-Chief. Rogers would soon wish that the king had turned him down. The fleet entered New Providence Island on the 24th of July, 1718. Rogers' first sight wasn't pretty. The fields outside Nassau town lay shrubby and overgrown, The beach lay strewn with some 40 captured vessels, burned or otherwise ruined, and the wind carried a putrid stink. In the harbour he found a fleet of ships flying the skull and crossbones. The same flag soared above the ruined fort. This was all the work of Charles Vane. He had once been an unremarkable pirate, until news of royal pardons reached the pirate paradise. When his comrades turned against him, the fanatic rose to explosive prominence, and had since become a dictator of sorts over the island. It didn't take long for Vane to open negotiations with Rogers. He wanted the new governor to show patience, and allow the pirates to dispose of their goods. Then they would gladly surrender. Rogers did not respond. So when Vane realized the trick was up, he sent a fireship at Rogers' fleet, and used the ensuing chaos to escape. Rogers had taken Nassau, but at considerable cost and some humiliation. But this landing was marked by much pomp. 2 ships fired 11-gun salutes, and the governor was received by a group of pardoned pirates. They formed an orderly line on either side of the road, and as Rogers walked past, fired their musket in a running salute. Rogers climbed the fort and addressed the crowd. Now, the real work could begin. The fort was in a complete mess. It was ruined and overgrown, and Charles Vane had taken all the cannons. Rogers' men constructed shelters and tents for the soldiers and colonists. He himself moved into the old governor's house, where he held consultation between his government and the various residents. The good mood shattered when news arrived from Charles Vane, promising to team up with Blackbeard and burn Nassau to the ground. More worrying news alarmed Rogers that the Spanish were planning to put an end to Bahamian piracy and raise Nassau themselves. The fort had to be repaired as quickly as possible. However, the expedition had pretty much all fallen sick from tropical illnesses. Rogers himself got sick and was bedridden. Meanwhile, the locals were immune, but that made him no less helpful. Rogers described them as lazy at both farming, repairing, and serving in the militia. As if things couldn't get any worse, the Navy announced that they were leaving Rogers to his own, taking with them their 3 men of war and 300 Marines. Now he was completely unprotected. Things did not improve. Nassau was racked by rains and storms. One of Rogers' ships and crews turned to piracy. And now, Charles Vane had set up camp on the nearby island of Abaco. Rogers put his trust in 2 of his most avid supporters, Captain Benjamin Hornigold and John Cockram. They were former pirates and accepted privateering commissions, allowing them to hunt down their former comrades. Whilst they set sail, Rogers instituted martial laws and ordered every denizen and slave to aid in repairs. Interestingly enough, Benjamin Hornigold had actually been the one who had established the pirate hideout on Nassau a few years prior. Though this wasn't to fight England, it was to fight the Spanish who hated him, so he didn't really have anything against joining England again. Anyway, 3 weeks later, Hornigold returned. Though Charles Vane had escaped, the pirate hunter had captured several of the fugitives. This boosted morale considerably, and Rogers wrote very positively of Hornigold. However, whilst Rogers wanted the captives hanged, the pardoned pirates wanted him to show clemency. These were their old friends after all. But Rogers eventually had enough. On the 9th of December, the 10 prisoners were taken to court. The trial lasted 2 days, during which 9 pirates were found guilty. All of them were sentenced to death by hanging. Only 1 man was saved at the last minute, after Rogers discovered that he knew the boy's parents. A few men begged Rogers to delay the execution, but he refused. He wanted to send a message. On the 12th of December, a crowd of 300 gathered at the base of the fort. Their behavior was erratic. Some cheered at their former comrades. One of the doomed men laughed back at the crowd and kicked his shoes off, saying that some friends of his had often said he should die in his shoes, but that he would make them liars. The 8 condemned men were hanged, and though some protested, nothing more came of it. Some men conspired to kill Rogers and remake the pirate haven, but they were discovered and ignored. A few months later, Blackbeard was assassinated in Ocracoke, and Charles Vane was shipwrecked. He would later be taken to Jamaica and hanged. So far, it seems like New Providence was finally safe. Rogers is rightfully considered the man who ended Caribbean piracy. As you might guess, he was never quite popular amongst the pirates. Remnants of his book have been found inside one of Blackbeard's cannons. It had been torn apart and used as wadding. There is also speculation that the name of the pirate flag, Jolly Roger, was a jab at our boy Woody. Some pirates allegedly called their flag Johnny Rogers, which might very well have been an ironic mockery of their most hated foe. Rogers presumably clamped down on some of Nassau's moral excesses. He continued distributing religious pamphlets and likely closed down most of the brothels and taverns. He tried cracking down on adultery, including the affair between Anne Bonny and John Rackham. Anne's husband was actually one of Rogers' informants. War broke out between Spain and England, and in February of 1720, a Spanish fleet attacked Nassau. By now, the fort had been repaired and equipped with 50 guns, and a garrison of 600 soldiers and militiamen. The Spanish attempted a surprise attack with rowboats, but just 2 sentries alone were able to fire enough rounds into the invaders to scare them off. Both the sentries were freed blacks. Ironic that they were the ones who saved Rogers, who had been a professional slave trader. His trip to Madagascar had been to buy slaves. During his privateering voyage, he gifted a black woman as a sex slave to a Jesuit priest. That incident is rather bizarre, and Rogers wrote rather descriptively about the priest's perverted expression. The Bahamas were secured, but Rogers' physical and financial resources were exhausted. The government ignored him, merchants denied him credit, and the colonists were unproductive. He almost died twice from poor health. He took a vacation to South Carolina to improve his health, but was wounded in a duel. In 1721, he sailed himself to London, in hopes of improving relations with the court. When he arrived, he learned that the king had fired him. His investments had been liquidated, and Rogers was bankrupt once again. His creditors moved in on him, and he was put in debtor's prison. The man who had sacrificed his own wealth and health over and again for the well-being of his country had been abandoned by everyone and left behind bars. But his creditors actually took pity on him, and he was freed shortly after. By now he was sickly and deeply depressed. He wrote that, "For some time I was very much perplexed with the melancholy prospect of my affairs." In 1722, Rogers was approached by the unknown author of the book that would become A General History of the Pirates. Rogers contributed greatly to the writing of the book, since he was so intimately familiar with the pirate commonwealth he alone was almost entirely responsible for ending. Though the book contained a lot of inaccuracies, the public loved it, and Rogers became a national hero once more. In 1726, Britain's elite decided to reward Rogers for his heroism. The authorities were moved by his written plea, where he wrote in third person that he, meaning Rogers, has lost 8 years of the prime of his life by his honest ambition and zeal in serving his country, and is left destitute of money for his service or any new employ, though no complaint has yet been made of any maladministration or want of doing his duty. In the end, Rogers was not only rewarded with a juicy pension, but in 1728 appointed to a second term as the governor of the Bahamas. Before leaving New Providence, the painter Hogarth eternalized Rogers' likeness in the only painting that exists of the man. He is placed in a romanticized version of Nassau, with his face in profile, hiding the gruesome disfigurement he sustained from the Manila Galleon. Nassau was far from the pleasant likeness painted by Hogarth. The island had recently been hit by a hurricane, and the economy was in shambles. The only new improvements were a gatehouse, a church in the town center, and the government house, where Rogers would spend the final 2 years of his life. Rogers spent his term as governor arguing with the local planters and trying to build a family fortune. He sent his son on several slaving trips to West Africa, and in 1735, his son would die from a tropical fever in Whydah. That was just 3 years after his old man. Rogers was never able to recover his health, but perhaps he passed in some manner of peace at the age of 53, on the 15th of July, 1732. His resting place has been lost to time, but his name adorns the main street on Nassau's waterfront, and his legend and contribution to the islands lives on in the Bahamas' official motto: "Pirates expelled, commerce restored." A mastodontic super mega thanks to my generous supporters over on Patreon: Cole Freer, Max Dweck, 1660, Michael Jantz, Rachel, Lockar, Dyer, Flintlock, and Ted11. If you want to support me monetarily, Please check out the links to PayPal and Patreon in the description below. This is what helps me fund my research and make better videos. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment, so the algorithm will spread it to more potential viewers. And why not share it with a friend? Cheers.